Today we are going to discuss and show examples of milled millet and buckwheat. Malt is stored unmilled and is only milled prior to using it. Milled malt that is not used may degrade relatively quickly. While we make specific mill gap setting recommendations for each type of malt, we realize that different brewers may have their own preferences in how coarsely or finely they prefer to mill their own malt. We will discuss some of the advantages and disadvantages of the different gap settings. In this shot, as with the rice malt and naked rice malt examples, we have the rice hulls at the top of the video. Buckwheat is in the middle and millet is at the bottom. We'll adjust the camera to look a little more closely at the buckwheat and millet malt. Here we have an example of a coarsely ground millet and buckwheat malt. Both millet and buckwheat malt have hulls, just like the rice hulls at the top. People don't think of it in terms of having a hull like rice malt, because rice malt has a very tough seed that needs to be milled. Buckwheat and millet malt, it's much softer and mills relatively easily. But in this coarse grind, you can see that the starch is separated from the hull, and the hull is it's actually very intact. Buckwheat has kind of a pyramid shape to it, and the millet malt are round. These were milled at the same gap setting. After we ran the millet through, we ran the buckwheat through at the same exact setting, so there's no difference as far as the settings. In this next example, we're going to look at the recommended mill gap setting that we have on our website. The malts are milled a little bit finer. There's some, the starch actually starts to kind of coat all of the malt, the hulls, and doesn't actually reduces the contrast as far as looking at comparisons, because everything's kind of coated in that in the starch that kind of turns into a finer powder the finer you mill it. Again, same gap settings, the recommended setting on our website, within that range, and both the buckwheat and millet went through the mill at the same setting. You can see the millet still and the buckwheat both maintain their hull. The millet has kind of a nice half moon shape to it, which maintains the integrity of the hull, but also does a better job releasing and grinding down the starches. The buckwheat at the top, you can see that distinct pyramid shape is still maintained, but the individual sides, I guess, of the pyramid shape it's kind of flattened. It's not just cracked open like the previous example. The sides are kind of separated from one another, and but the hull is still intact. This last example is a finer grind yet, and you can see it's more of has a more powdery consistency, and the hulls are pretty well ground down. We're not saying that this would result in a stuck mash, but it certainly is more likely to result in a stuck mash. It might take more rice hulls in the mash to make sure that it doesn't get stuck. In this first comparison shot, you can see the coarser grind on the right and the recommended range on the left. You can see that the coarser grind, it's much more cracked as opposed to being properly milled. The left side, you can see some powderiness to it, because the starch is actually getting milled down, but the hull is being maintained. In the next side-by-side comparison, we have the finer grind on the left, and now the recommended is on the right side. And in this example, you can see that it's getting more powdery the finer you go. The hull is being ground down as well. You're releasing a lot of starches, but you're losing some of the integrity in the hull itself. In the last side-by-side comparison, we'll look at the, actually let's slide this up here so you can see the millet a bit better. The coarser grind on the left, and now the finer grind is on the right side. And you can see how well intact the hull is on the coarse grind, but how well the starches are released on the right side. So, as we said in our introduction, we know brewers have their own personal preferences. Obviously, the finer of the grind, the more starch you're going to release, and you're also going to grind down the hull, and that hull is important for making sure you don't get a stuck mash. Make sure that it's not just a matter of the mash getting stuck in that you can't get the wort out of it, but it's also the circulation during the mash. You need that movement in the mash so that there's flow in the mash, that your grain bed is floating, and the enzymes can perform their functions. If you have basically no hull whatsoever, whether it's the millet hull or the buckwheat hull or adding additional rice hulls, if you don't have that circulation during the mash, you're not going to get the efficiency and conversion you want. During the sparge process, when you're actually collecting your wort, the hulls, again, regardless if they're millet, buckwheat, or rice, it acts as a natural filtration process, and you'll get very clean wort in your brew kettle if you have sufficient filtration from hulls. Thank you for watching our video blog today. We are working on additional video and written blogs, including brewing a amber ale from a partial mash and a partial grain brewing process, and comparing the results. We're also getting back to some of our earlier work where we are working with enzymes and different mash temperatures and times, and comparing the results. So you have a lot to look forward to. Thank you for watching.